The wind blew like a memory through the scrub grass of Whiskey Ridge, dry and restless. Clara McAlister stood alone on her porch, boots planted firm on the warped wood, shotgun cradled in one arm and a chipped enamel coffee cup in the other. The sun had just crested the ridge, casting long orange fingers across the prairie. It was morning, but Clara looked like she hadn't slept a full night in months. McAlister Ranch, her ranch now, had once bustled with a dozen cowhands and a herd thick enough to block the view to the creek. That was before her husband Thomas died in a nighttime cattle raid last spring. Since then, the herd had thinned, the hands had drifted off, and Clara was left with two young'uns, a mountain of debt, and a pile of ghosts she couldn't shake. The banker came by every third week, all smiles and polished boots, reminding her of the payments. The ranch hands who stayed, mostly old Amos and a couple of part-time kids, couldn't keep up with repairs, much less run the ranch at full tilt. She was holding on by grit, spite, and the steady aim of her father's shotgun. On this particular morning, Clara spotted a figure coming up the road. Horse trotting slow, rider slouched. A drifter by the look, dusty, alone, and carrying everything he owned in a saddlebag. Clara's jaw tightened. Strangers meant trouble more often than not. He stopped at the edge of her fence, raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said, voice rough as gravel but polite. "What's your business?" Clara called out. She didn't lower the shotgun. "Looking for work. Name's Jesse Cade." She didn't recognize the name. Didn't trust him either. But Amos vouched for the man later, said he'd seen him ride for the Cartwright outfit 2 counties over. "Hard worker," Amos said. "Keeps to himself. Good with a rope and better with his word." Clara needed help. That was the truth. Winter was coming fast, and the barn roof still leaked. She gave Cade a week's trial and a spot in the bunkhouse, which was more like a shack with one good stove. The man didn't say much, didn't ask questions either. He rode fence lines, fixed gates, and got up before sunup. The kids, Eli and June, took to him quicker than Clara liked. He carved little horses out of scrap wood for Eli and helped June set snares out by the creek. Still, Clara kept her distance. She'd buried one cowboy already. She wasn't about to let another one get close. That night, Clara found herself staring at the empty side of her bed, cursing herself for wondering where Jesse Cade had bedded down. 3 weeks in, the man was still there. Jesse fixed the barn roof and got the corral in working order. He worked without complaint and spoke little, except when the kids peppered him with questions about horses, knots, or the stars. Clara watched him from the kitchen window sometimes. There was a stillness about him, like a man carrying something too heavy to speak of. She respected that, still didn't trust it. Then Sheriff Boyd Rawlins showed up. He rode in wearing that smug grin he always wore when he was sizing up trouble. Clara had known Rawlins since she was a girl. He'd courted her once, back when her heart still fluttered. Now his presence made her spine itch. "You got a new hand," he said, tying off his horse. "Jesse Cade." "Yeah, what about it?" Rawlins stepped up on the porch. "You know who he is?" Clara crossed her arms. "He's a man who gets the job done. He's a man with a bounty behind him, or used to be. Rode with the Blackthorn gang for a spell, back in the Dakota Territories. They burned a rail depot, killed a marshal." Clara's face didn't change. "That true?" she asked. "Heard it from the Pinkertons themselves." Rawlins leaned closer. "Just saying, I'd be careful who I let around my kids." That night, Clara sat out by the barn while Jesse rubbed down the horses. She watched the way his hands moved, efficient, calm, not the hands of a man itching for violence. "Sheriff came by," she said. Jesse didn't look up. "I figured he would." "He says you rode with the Blackthorn gang." Jesse let the brush still in his hand. The silence stretched. "I did, for a time," he said finally. "Left before things got bad. Tried to keep my hands clean, but Not everything washes off. Why'd you leave? He looked at her then, real direct. Because I was tired of running with men who only knew how to take. One day, I looked around and saw I'd become someone I hated. Clara said nothing, just walked back toward the house, unsure of what to think. A week later, the trouble came. It started with missing cattle, then tracks. Amos found boot prints out by the north pasture, too many to be ranch hands. Then the barn was set fire late one night, flames licking the sky before Jesse and Amos got it under control. Clara found a note nailed to her porch the next morning. Leave or lose everything like your husband. She clenched her jaw and turned to Jesse. You still got those old skills? Jesse nodded once. I do. Then I reckon it's time you used 'em. Clara sat at the kitchen table the next morning, the smell of strong coffee filling the room, but her mind was far from the comfort of a warm cup. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral. The note left on the porch had been clear enough. Leave or lose everything. And it wasn't just the threat to her land and livelihood that churned her stomach. It was the mounting fear that whoever was behind this knew her weaknesses and wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jesse had come to the ranch as a stranger, a man with a quiet past, but now, with the fire in the barn and the cattle disappearing, Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of his past hanging over them all like a storm cloud. She'd asked him once, just a simple question about the man he used to be, and he had given her an answer, honest, direct. But the truth, as she was beginning to understand, was far more complicated than just a story of a man trying to escape his past. Jesse Cade had a history that ran deeper than the dusty trails of Whiskey Ridge, a history that had already begun to catch up with them. The first time Clara had heard the sound of gunfire since Thomas died, it was Jesse who was standing between her and the world that seemed intent on tearing her apart. It was early, the first hint of dawn barely making its way over the horizon. Clara was already up, feeding the chickens and checking the barn for any signs of trouble. The note from the previous night still burned in her mind, but it was the chill in the air that made her senses even sharper. She could feel something on the wind, a kind of tension that made her skin crawl. She'd barely crossed the yard when the sound of hooves rang out from the direction of the road. Jesse's horse was already tethered to the post by the barn, and Clara had hoped he was out at the north pasture, fixing the fence. But the rider approaching was not Jesse. It was a man on horseback, his gait steady, but his eyes filled with something more dangerous than mere curiosity. Clara reached instinctively for the rifle she kept by the back door, her hands shaking as she pulled it into her grip. The man stopped in front of the porch, not quite dismounting, his face shaded by the brim of his hat. She could see the outline of a rifle tucked against his side. "I reckon you're the widow," the man said, his voice rough, like it had been scraped from the depths of a whiskey bottle. "Depends on who's asking," Clara replied, trying to keep her tone steady. The man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Heard about you, McAlister's wife. Ran that ranch of his real good, didn't ya?" Clara didn't respond, just took a step back toward the door, making sure the rifle was steady in her hands. "What do you want?" "I'm just here to talk, darlin'," the man drawled. "But I reckon talk's cheap in this part of the world. You got something that belongs to me." "I don't know what you mean," Clara said. "You best turn around and leave now." The man dismounted with a lazy movement, his spurs clinking as he hit the ground. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "Your ranch ain't yours anymore, Miss McAlister. Not if you don't make the right choice. Tell that drifter of yours to pack up and head on out. This place ain't safe for him, and it sure as hell ain't safe for you neither." Before Clara could raise the rifle, Jesse was there, quiet as a shadow but with the strength of a storm behind his movements. He was standing between her and the stranger, his hand already on the butt of his revolver. "Think you've got the wrong idea, friend," Jesse said, his voice calm but cold. "You best be leaving, or this'll get ugly real quick." The stranger looked at Jesse, then back at Clara. He seemed to weigh his options for a moment before his lip curled into a sneer. "I warned you," he muttered, then spat on the ground and mounted his horse. "You'll get what's coming to you." Jesse didn't move until the man had ridden off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Then, without a word, Jesse turned to Clara. "That was a warning," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The gang's still out there." Clara didn't need to ask who the gang was. She had heard enough to know. They were the same men who had killed Thomas, the same men who had been circling the ranch like vultures ever since. But the question that burned in her chest wasn't about who was coming. It was about how much longer they could hold out. That afternoon, Clara found herself in the barn with Jesse, the two of them working in silence as they reinforced the wooden walls. She caught him glancing at her more than once, his eyes troubled but determined. "What happens now?" Clara finally asked, wiping the sweat from her brow. Jesse set down the hammer he'd been working with and looked at her. "I reckon we make a stand," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have much choice." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. "You're saying we fight them?" He nodded. "I've been running from that kind of life for years, but there's no running now. You can't just back down from men like that." Clara felt the weight of his words sink in. They'd been sitting on a powder keg, and now, with the gang closing in, the fuse had been lit. But she wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a mother, a rancher, and she wasn't about to let anyone take her home from her. "We'll fight," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "But I'm not doing it alone." For the first time, Jesse's expression softened, just a little. "You won't be," he said quietly. That night, Clara sat in the darkness of the kitchen, the air thick with tension. The kids had long since gone to bed, but sleep eluded her. The sound of distant coyotes was the only thing that broke the silence. Jesse had gone to the creek to check the traps he'd set earlier. She'd heard him move out, his footsteps steady and sure. She didn't know if he was coming back, and a part of her didn't want him to, not if it meant losing him too. But then, from outside, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves, a steady clip-clop that didn't belong to any horse she knew. The door creaked open, and Jesse stepped inside, his face grim but his eyes steady. "They're coming," he said simply. Clara nodded. She didn't need to ask how he knew. The way the wind had shifted earlier that evening, the silence in the air, it was a warning. The storm was about to hit. Jesse crossed the room to the window, his silhouette dark against the dim light of the stars. "We make our stand tonight," he said. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We meet them head on." Clara swallowed hard, the fear in her chest rising like a tide. She had never been more afraid in her life, but she also knew one thing. There was no turning back now. Not for her, not for her kids, and not for the ranch. The storm was coming, and they were ready to face it, together. The night air was thick with anticipation, the wind carrying an odd stillness over Whiskey Ridge as Clara stood by the porch, her hand gripping the shotgun's cold barrel. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, their silent light casting shadows over the land, shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing minute. Jesse had said they'd make their stand tonight, and Clara could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her chest like a storm cloud ready to break. The gang was coming. It wasn't just the cattle rustlers or the men who wanted her land anymore. This was personal. The leader of the gang, a man named Halstead, had been after her ranch since Thomas died. And now, with the help of the sheriff, who had been secretly working with the gang, the situation had grown worse. Clara felt a calm settling over her as she checked her shotgun once more, a quick motion that had become second nature. The house was dark, the kids asleep in their rooms. She had told them it would be safe, but deep down Clara knew this was a lie. The kids didn't know the weight of what was coming. They couldn't, but Clara did. This was a fight for their home, their future, and everything that had ever mattered to her. From the window, she saw Jesse moving about the barn, his silhouette just a shadow in the moonlight, checking the horses and preparing for the fight that had already begun. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. Jesse Cade had become something else, the only person she could rely on when it mattered most. The distant sound of hooves echoed through the night, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. Clara's pulse quickened. She motioned toward the barn, signaling to Jesse. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were about to face. Jesse had trained his whole life for moments like this, and yet Clara knew it wasn't just the fight he had been preparing for. It was the chance to finally outrun the ghosts of his past. The first wave of riders appeared at the far edge of the ridge, their figures blurry and distant against the darkened sky. They were coming, just as Jesse had said they would. "Get ready," Jesse's voice came low behind her. "They'll be here any minute." Clara's heart thudded against her ribs as she checked the barn once more, making sure all the windows were closed and the back door was secure. The ranch was a sitting target, but there wasn't much they could do about that now. Every hour they held the line was a victory. Every minute they bought was a chance to make it through the night. Jesse returned to her side, his face set in hard lines, eyes narrowed against the growing wind. The time for words was over. There was only the job ahead. Clara took a deep breath, wiped her palms against her pants, and felt the cold metal of the shotgun in her grip. This wasn't how she had imagined her life, standing at the edge of everything she had fought for. But sometimes, the life you dreamed of wasn't the life you got. The riders were almost upon them now. Clara's fingers tightened around the gun. She could see them in the distance, their horses riding low and steady, the dust kicked up around them in a cloud that made the air smell of gunpowder and burnt leather. Jesse turned to her one last time before heading out to the barn door. "Keep your head down," he said, and there was a weight in his voice she hadn't heard before, a quiet finality. Clara didn't respond. She just nodded and stepped out into the yard, the tension of the moment settling over her like a shroud. They were coming. There was no more running. The first shot rang out from the far side of the barn, a loud crack that shattered the stillness of the night. Clara's heart jumped in her chest, and she snapped the rifle up to her shoulder. Her hands didn't shake. They couldn't. She had to be steady, had to be strong. Through the darkness, she could see the figures of men on horseback charging toward them. They were armed, some with rifles, others with pistols. And at the front of the group, Clara could see Halstead, the leader, his dark eyes glinting with malice. The man had been hunting her for a long time, and he wasn't about to stop now. "Ready!" Jesse shouted from the barn. Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she watched as one of the riders fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. A second shot came from the other side, followed by another. Jesse was doing his part, his rifle echoing in the night air. The gang hadn't expected such resistance. They'd thought the widow's ranch would be easy pickings, but now they were met with fire from all sides. Halstead's men spread out, using the cover of the ridge to try and flank the barn, but Jesse had already anticipated their moves. With each step, Clara felt her confidence grow. This was her fight. This was her land, and no one was going to take it without a fight. The gunfire grew more intense as the gang tried to push forward. Clara fired again, her shot grazing the shoulder of one of the men. He cried out, but kept charging forward, only to be cut down by Jesse's quick aim. The barn was alive with the sound of rifle shots, hooves, and the occasional scream as one of the riders met their end. But the gang wasn't giving up. They were too many, and their numbers were slowly pushing the McAlister defense back. The gang had more men than Jesse and Clara had counted on. Then, just as the situation seemed to grow darker, Clara heard the sound of boots hitting the ground behind her. It was Amos, followed by Eli and June. They had snuck out of the house, weapons in hand, ready to join the fray. "You said you wouldn't fight alone," Amos grinned, his face weathered but determined. "Looks like you've got some backup, Miss Clara." With a determined nod, Clara fired again, hitting one of the riders in the chest. Amos was quick, pulling a revolver from his belt and returning fire. Eli and June had a rifle between them, but their shots were wild. Clara yelled at them to keep low and stay out of the way, but she couldn't help but feel a swelling pride. The kids weren't backing down. They were in this, just like her. The gang was faltering now. The dust of the battlefield hung in the air, thick and choking, as the riders scattered, some retreating, some pushing forward. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her focus. She had to finish this, for herself, for her family. Then Halstead charged. His horse galloped forward, a blur of motion and fury, a single figure in the chaos. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the showdown she had been dreading. She didn't wait. She stepped forward, raising the rifle. Jesse appeared from the shadows, his revolver in hand, eyes hard as steel. They were together now, and there was nothing left but to face him head on. Halstead charged, his gun raised, a wild look in his eyes. But Jesse's aim was faster. A shot rang out, and Halstead's horse reared up, throwing him to the ground. The fight had shifted. Halstead struggled to stand, but Jesse was already there, his revolver trained on him. "I reckon this is where it ends, Halstead," Jesse said, his voice cold. Halstead snarled, trying to reach for his gun, but it was no use. Jesse was faster. Clara stepped forward, the gun still in her hands, her heart racing. "You're not getting this ranch, Halstead. Not now, not ever." The sun rose slowly over the ridge, casting a golden light over the wreckage of the battle. The gang was gone, scattered, or captured. The ranch, though damaged, had held. The McAlisters had survived. Jesse stood next to Clara, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You did good," he said quietly. Clara glanced at him, her heart filled with something more than gratitude. "We did good," she replied. And in that moment, Clara realized something. She hadn't just fought for her land. She had fought for her future. And for the first time since Thomas had died, she felt like she could finally breathe again. The battle was over. The ranch was hers, and so too was the man who had stayed. Together, they would rebuild, stronger than ever before. The ranch was quieter now. The dust of battle had settled, and the wreckage of Whiskey Ridge had begun to heal. It was a slow process, but Clara could feel it. The way the land was slowly coming back to life, the way the sun seemed to shine a little brighter each day, and how the creaking of the old barn no longer held the same threat it had just weeks before. Now it was just the sound of a place working, thriving in spite of the storm that had tried to tear it apart. Clara stood by the barn that afternoon, her hand resting lightly on the fence post, her gaze drifting over the pasture. The cattle had returned, the herd now thriving in the open fields. The grass was lush again, green and full. It had taken weeks to mend the fences, rebuild the lost structures, and recover from the fire that had almost consumed everything. But the ranch was strong, stronger even than it had been before. Jesse was beside her, his quiet presence a comfort in the midst of everything that had transpired. His hand rested lightly on the top rail of the fence, the same rail that had been scorched by the fire, the same rail that had once seemed like a symbol of all that was lost. But now, it was a symbol of what had been reclaimed. The winds had changed direction since the day they'd made their stand, and Jesse was no longer the drifter who had wandered in from the outlands. He had a place now, a purpose, and a future, one that was just as tied to Whiskey Ridge as Clara's was. Their futures were tangled together now, like the vines of wildflowers that wound through the fences and the trees. He wasn't just a man trying to outrun his past anymore. He had confronted it, faced it head on, and had come out the other side a different person. Clara couldn't help but smile as she looked at him, knowing full well that, though the storm had passed, the journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. It had been a few months since the battle, and life on the ranch had returned to some semblance of normalcy, but the scars of the fight were still present. The town had heard the rumors, the whispers about what had happened on Whiskey Ridge, the final stand against the men who had terrorized the area for so long. There were those who had respected what Clara had done, and there were others who whispered about the price she had paid. But the ranch was hers, and the world was starting to realize that Clara McAlister was not someone to be underestimated. She had spent the first few weeks in a haze of exhaustion, a blur of rebuilding, healing, and protecting the ranch from any further threats. But now, standing at the fence, watching Jesse at work with the horses, Clara felt the weight of everything that had happened slowly lifting. They had done what they needed to do, and now they could begin to look toward the future. Jesse had become part of the land, just as much as the rock and the dirt beneath their feet. He had stayed, just as he had promised, and now, as they stood side by side, there was no question in Clara's mind about where they were headed. Together, they were headed forward, and they would face whatever challenges came next with the same resilience that had gotten them through the worst of the storm. The days ahead were uncertain, as they always were on the open range, but Clara had learned something in the months since Thomas's death, something that would stay with her as long as she lived. You never knew what tomorrow would bring. You never knew what was waiting just over the next ridge. But you could choose to face it, whatever it was, and you could choose to keep going, to live. And, most importantly, you could choose to love, even when it seemed impossible. That night, Clara sat in the kitchen, a kettle of coffee brewing on the stove, the scent filling the house as the last rays of the sun slipped behind the mountains. The kids were in bed, and the house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Jessie moved through the house. There had been no shortage of things to do over the past few months, but now it felt like there was a sense of peace settling over everything. Jessie stepped into the room, his boots scraping lightly against the floor, and Clara looked up at him. He was carrying something in his hands, a small wrapped bundle that looked out of place in the otherwise rough-hewn world of Whiskey Ridge. "What's that?" Clara asked, her curiosity piqued. Jessie set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small, intricately carved box made of dark wood. It was simple, but beautiful in its craftsmanship. Clara's fingers brushed over it as Jessie explained. "I thought it was time," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Time for you to have something of your own, something that's just for you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had never been one for trinkets or sentimental gifts, but the gesture felt deeply personal. The box was small, enough to hold a few keepsakes, a note, a photograph, a memory. She reached out and ran her fingers over the wood, feeling the smoothness of it. For a long moment she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The weight of what had been lost and what had been gained was too much to put into words. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. It was all she could manage. Jessie sat down across from her, watching as she traced the patterns of the carved wood. He seemed content in the silence, as though there was nothing left to say. In a way, there wasn't. They had already said everything that mattered. They had faced their pasts, fought their battles, and had come through on the other side. Clara finally looked up, meeting his gaze, her heart full. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "for a long time, I didn't think I'd ever be happy again. I didn't think I could love anyone after Thomas." Jesse nodded, his eyes dark but understanding. "I don't reckon you ever stop loving someone once they've meant something to you. But you can learn to love again. It's a choice." Clara smiled at him, the smile of someone who had learned, the hard way, what it meant to let go of the past and move into the future. She had loved once, and now, here she was, learning how to love again, to build a new life, a new family, and a new legacy for the ranch. And she wasn't doing it alone. She stood crossing the room to where Jesse sat. With a quiet gesture she kissed him, not as a promise of tomorrow, but as a reflection of everything they had already shared. The love they had built wasn't new. It was old, carved into the land and into their souls. It was something that had survived the fire, the gunfire, and the storms of the past, and now it would grow with them. "I think we're going to be all right," Clara said quietly, pulling away from the kiss. "I know we are," Jesse replied, his voice firm but gentle. The ranch, Whiskey Ridge, was more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol. It was where they had fought for their future. It was where they had found each other, where they had fought, and where they would rebuild. Together. And in the end, that was all that mattered.
If this story stirred something in you, whether it was a memory, a feeling, or just that quiet ache only a good Western can bring, then stick around. Here at Saddlehorn Stories, we tell the kind of tales that ride deep into the heart. Stories of hard land, harder choices, and the folks who keep going anyway. There's more where this came from. More grit, more heart, more moments that make you stop and sit a little longer in the saddle. Every week we bring you short westerns, packed with dust, soul, and that slow-burning kind of truth that only shows itself when the fire's low and the stars are out. So if you enjoyed this one, do us a favor. Hit that like button and let us know you're out there. And if you're looking for more stories that feel like home or maybe just a place to wander for a while, go on and subscribe. You'll be the first to know when a fresh tale rolls in. Until then, keep your boots by the door and your heart open. The trail's long, but you don't have to ride it alone.